In medieval Europe, the method of execution announced a person's rank, their crime, and the community's idea of justice. Nobles could be granted the swift axe. Commoners more often faced hanging, public humiliation, or corporal penalties for theft, assault, or banditry. Crimes like heresy or treason drew punishments meant to mark them as moral contagions, while lesser offenses were punished to deter repeat offenders and restore social order. These practices were as much about spectacle and hierarchy as they were about law. Who you were decided how you died. Over centuries, debates about mercy, equality, and the purpose of punishment, atonement, deterrence, or retribution, reshaped execution from ritualized display toward more rational methods. Watch this series to see which punishments matched which crimes, how status shaped sentences, and how medieval ideas about justice set the stage for later reforms, offering a clearer view of how societies try to balance order, punishment, and moral meaning. The trial not as justice, but as a public spectacle. Trials in medieval towns and market squares were staged events meant to be seen as much as to settle facts. Officials read charges aloud. Witnesses were called before assembled neighbors, and the accused could be paraded through streets so that the community would know both the crime and the outcome. Torture was sometimes used to extract confessions in secular courts, and ecclesiastical procedures often included public penance or admonition. These procedures made the adjudication itself part of the performance. Religious rites frequently accompanied the last moments of the condemned, with priests administering confession and absolution to frame execution as both punishment and spiritual reckoning. For different offenses, the law prescribed distinct, recognizable punishments, each carrying its own message. Petty theft and public disorder were often punished with the stocks, pillory, whipping, or branding, sanctions meant to humiliate and mark the offender for the community. Violent crimes such as murder or banditry typically led to harsher corporal penalties like hanging or the breaking wheel on the continent, methods intended to signal the severity of the crime. Crimes viewed as direct attacks on political order, treason, for example, could bring the most extreme, symbolic penalties, while accusations of heresy or witchcraft were usually handled by ecclesiastical courts that could impose penance and then hand the condemned to secular authorities for execution, commonly by burning. Lesser infractions could be resolved with fines and restitution, practical remedies that stood in contrast to the more theatrical corporal punishments. Where social rank mattered, execution methods reflected and reinforced hierarchy. Nobles and persons of high status were typically granted more honorable deaths. Beheading by sword or axe was seen as quicker and more dignified, whereas commoners faced methods that emphasized humiliation and pain. This legal differentiation was not merely about mercy. It communicated the social order back to the populace by visibly distinguishing who merited respect in life and death. Public executions, with their crowds and commentary, thus functioned like civic lessons. The manner of a sentence taught people where they belonged in the social and political hierarchy. Philosophically, the spectacle combined several aims of punishment: atonement, deterrence, and retribution. Public rites of confession and the opportunity for the condemned to do penance addressed the spiritual need for atonement and reassured communities that divine as well as secular justice had been satisfied. The visibility of the punishment was intended to deter potential offenders by making consequences unmistakable. Retribution was enacted visibly and proportionally. The more grievous the offense in the eyes of law and society, the starker the penalty. At the same time, practical goals, restoring property through fines or restitution, confirming communal norms, and legitimizing the authority of rulers and courts, were folded into the theatricality. In short, medieval trials as public spectacle wove legal, moral, and social threads together so that justice appeared not only as an abstract ideal, but as a communal performance. The gallows, the simplicity and publicity of a democratic death. Across medieval Europe, hanging on a gallows functioned as the routine instrument of final punishment for the bulk of capital offenses committed by commoners. Theft, highway robbery, murder, and breaches of royal or manorial peace were the kinds of crimes that most frequently resulted in a sentence to the gallows. Local courts and manorial jurisdictions regularly enforced such sentences because a simple wooden frame was cheap to erect and easy to use. Manorial privileges like the rights of infangthif and outfangthif illustrate how lords could try and execute thieves found within their jurisdiction, sending a clear signal that ordinary criminals fell under the immediate authority of local rulers rather than distant princes. In towns, borough courts played the same role. In forested areas, violations of forest law could likewise lead to hanging, reinforcing how the type of offense and the place it was committed shaped the punishment. Publicity was central to the gallows' purpose. Executions were staged where they could be widely seen, on hills, at crossroads, or just outside town gates, so that the sight of the condemned, the sound of the procession, and the spoken pronouncement of guilt all became part of a communal lesson. Crowds gathered not merely for spectacle, but because execution ceremonies performed multiple civic functions. They confirmed the authority of the court, permitted a final confession or sermon that addressed both the condemned and the onlookers, and turned abstract law into a concrete, visible consequence. Bodies were sometimes left on display to warn travelers and deter potential offenders. The display was an extension of local deterrence strategies rather than an end in itself. Social hierarchy shaped not only who was likely to be sent to the gallows, but also who would be spared it. A beheading with an axe or sword was widely regarded as a more honorable form of death and was typically reserved for nobles, knights, and those of higher rank. Clergy who claimed benefit of clergy could often avoid secular hanging by being tried in ecclesiastical courts and receiving penance or lighter sentences instead. In practice, therefore, the label democratic fits only in the narrow sense that the rope was a publicly accessible instrument. Legal privilege, rank, and influence frequently produced very different outcomes for the same or similar offenses. The gallows must also be read through the era's philosophies of punishment. Atonement, deterrence, and retribution were intertwined in practice. Trials and executions were opportunities for the condemned to confess and receive last rites, offering a ritualized atonement in the eyes of church and community. At the same time, the placement and publicity of hangings were designed to deter. Lawmakers and local rulers hoped the visible consequence would reduce repeat offenses and secure public order. Retribution, understood as restoring communal balance after a crime, was enacted in plain view so that justice felt performed and communal trust in law could be reaffirmed. Together, these elements made the gallows a cornerstone of medieval penal practice. Simple in construction, public in presentation, and complex in its social and moral implications. Decapitation by sword, the privilege of the nobility and the executioner's skill. During the Middle Ages, beheading with a sword functioned as a marked distinction between classes, a legal and symbolic concession extended to those of noble birth. Crimes that threatened the political order, treason, rebellion, or the assassination of a lord, could lead to execution for nobles, but the mode of death was meant to recognize rank even in punishment. Lower-ranking offenders convicted of similar offenses were far more likely to face hanging, drawing and quartering, burning, or the breaking wheel. Such methods were slower and more visibly degrading. The sword, by contrast, was read as a dignified instrument, efficient, spare of spectacle, and consistent with the martial identity of the aristocracy. In several regions of Europe, the sword was preferred for noble executions because of its connotations of honor and of a soldier's death. The blade's use echoed chivalric ideals. The same weapon associated with a knight in life became, curiously, the means of a swift end. Elsewhere, comparable practices developed independently. In Japan, the ritual of seppuku could be concluded by a skilled attendant delivering a single decisive cut to the neck, an act intended to shorten suffering and preserve honor. These different cultural expressions share a logic. A decapitation carried out by sword implied a measure of mercy and respect that matched the condemned's social standing, while also serving the state's interest in categorizing and executing authority. Technical skill mattered in tense. Breaking on the wheel, the art of prolonging agony for hours. Across medieval Europe, the wheel was reserved for crimes judged by contemporaries to be especially destructive to social order. Deliberate murder, violent robbery that resulted in death, brigandage, and in some regions cases of parricide or particularly heinous assaults. In France, the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, and parts of Central and Eastern Europe, the punishment was codified in local law codes and municipal practice. By contrast, it was rare or absent in jurisdictions that preferred other forms of corporal punishment. Courts treated the wheel not as a generic penalty, but as a calibrated response to perceived moral danger, applied where judges and magistrates wished to mark the crime as beyond ordinary wrongdoing. The procedure itself combined legal ritual with physical incapacitation in a way meant to communicate both guilt and state authority. Condemned prisoners were publicly brought to the place of execution, sometimes after a procession and a final opportunity for confession. Executioners then bound the body to a large cartwheel or laid it upon the wheel and struck the limbs with a heavy iron implement in an ordered fashion designed to break bones and render movement impossible. Practices varied. Some courts required that the blows be delivered until death, while others prescribed breaking in particular sequences or allowed a final act of mercy, a fatal blow to the neck or chest, to shorten suffering once the sentence was fulfilled. Afterward, the body might be woven through burning at the stake, execution for heretics, and purification by fire. Medieval authorities commonly reserved fire for offenses seen as assaults on the spiritual order, heresy, certain forms of witchcraft, sacrilege, and in some regions, crimes that symbolically threatened communal salvation. Church courts investigated doctrinal deviation and moral corruption, but they lacked the power to carry out capital punishment. Once a clerical tribunal declared someone a heretic, the verdict was typically relaxed to the secular arm, handed over to secular officials to enact the sentence. That institutional division mattered. It allowed ecclesiastical authorities to pronounce spiritual condemnation while leaving the physical act of execution to lay power, and it framed burning as both a juridical and a sacramental moment, not merely a penal one. Public rituals often surrounded these sentences. Condemned individuals could be paraded in penitential garments, such as the San Benito in Iberian contexts, forced to confess or recant in front of the populace, and then led to a designated place for execution. The spectacle served several purposes at once. It was meant to mark the offender's moral fall and, where possible, their repentance. It also functioned as dramatic instruction, reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable belief and practice for everyone who watched. Some secular authorities chose practices intended to limit suffering. In various local customs, the condemned were strangled or otherwise rendered unconscious before the flames were set, especially if they drowning. Trial by water for witches and murderous wives. Two distinct practices dominated the use of water as both test and punishment in medieval and early modern communities: the ordeal or swimming test, and the ducking or cucking stool used as a form of public humiliation. In the swimming test, an accused person, most often a woman suspected of witchcraft, might be bound and immersed in a pond or river. Flotation was commonly interpreted as proof of guilt, because water was thought to reject a body that had consorted with demonic forces. The ducking stool, by contrast, was a municipal device, a chair or platform attached to a beam that allowed an offender to be plunged repeatedly into water as punishment for being a scold, a lewd person, or a disorderly wife. Both practices blurred lines between legal determination and corporal sanction, and both were concentrated in local courts and town authorities rather than in higher-level judicial systems. Communities applied these measures to different perceived offenses. Witchcraft accusations frequently led to the swimming test when ordinary evidence was lacking or when panic and rumor demanded a decisive signal. Local magistrates and villagers expected a visible judgment. Women accused of scolding, public indecency, or petty deception could be subjected to the ducking stool as a corrective spectacle intended to shame and restrain. For more serious crimes, like premeditated murder, drowning functioned less as a formal sentence in many regions. Instead, such crimes could lead to harsher or more honorable penalties depending on local law and the accused status. The water ordeals thus fit into a patchwork of sanctions, applied according to the perceived moral nature of the offense and the immediate needs of communal order. Social rank strongly shaped who faced immersion and how. Noble or propertied women rarely, if ever, endured public plunges. Their punishments tended to be formalized and, where execution was imposed, carried out by methods deemed more dignified by elite standards. Common women, on the other hand, were disproportionately targeted by ducking and swimming tests, reflecting a gendered grammar of suspicion and control. Municipal officials used immersion as a tool to police lower-class behavior and to enforce norms of female speech and sexuality. In short, the use of water as both test and punishment was not neutral. It reinforced hierarchies, allowing elites to distance themselves from the indignities reserved for those lower in status. The philosophy underpinning these practices combined ideas of atonement, deterrence, and retribution in uneasy ways. Water had symbolic purity in Christian thought, so subjecting an accused person to immersion could be framed as invoking divine judgment. If the element rejected them, that was taken as supernatural confirmation and therefore retributive justice. Public dunking served deterrence through spectacle. Townspeople watched to see social boundaries reaffirmed. Yet there was also an expectation of confession and moral correction. Especially with ducking, officials sought to humiliate offenders into future conformity. At the same time, the procedures betrayed a precarious balance between seeking truth and ensuring punishment. A person who sank might be innocent but die anyway, and a flotation deemed proof of guilt could rest on superstition rather than reliable evidence. Regional practices and evolving legal thought gradually eroded the legitimacy of immersion as a judicial tool, but its historical role reveals much about the priorities of medieval and early modern societies. Where communal cohesion and visible moral order mattered most, water served as both instrument and symbol. The legacy is complex. These punishments aim to restore a sense of equilibrium through retribution, deterrence, or forced atonement. Yet they often did so at the cost of fairness, disproportionately affecting the vulnerable and reflecting deeper anxieties about gender, authority, and the boundaries of communal justice. Boiling alive, punishment for counterfeiters. Across medieval Europe, courts treated the alteration or manufacture of coin as an attack on the sovereign's authority and the economic foundations of society, rather than merely a private theft. Because coin bore the ruler's mark, debasing, clipping, or producing counterfeit money was framed as usurping royal prerogative. That legal framing justified exceptionally harsh penalties in many jurisdictions. In several regions, the penalty reserved for serious coin crimes included death by immersion in boiling liquid, a punishment intended to mark the breach of trust at the heart of currency and commerce. Authorities used such extreme measures for several practical reasons. A stable currency depended on public confidence. Widespread counterfeiting could destabilize markets, reduce tax revenue, and provoke unrest. Public, painful executions were intended to advertise the risk of undermining that trust and to deter others contemplating similar crimes. Trials for coining often led to ancillary penalties too. Confiscation of tools and workshop, destruction of falsified dies, fines, and the public display of convicted coiners on pillories or gallows before more severe sentences were carried out. The choice of boiling as a method reflected symbolic as well as punitive logic. Boiling implied a kind of purification, a dramatic physical erasure of the contaminant within the body analogous to the melting and reworking of base metal. It also communicated the sovereign's need to visibly cleanse the currency and punish those who sullied it. That symbolism intersected with the medieval penal philosophy, where punishment served three overlapping aims: retribution for the crime against the ruler, deterrence to protect communal order, and a ritualized form of atonement that restored moral balance in the eyes of the community. Social status strongly influenced who received which form of punishment. Nobles and persons of higher rank were often granted more honorable deaths, decapitation being typical in many courts, while commoners faced methods intended to humiliate or physically degrade. Thus, a common coiner might be subjected to public shaming, mutilation, or boiling, whereas a person of noble birth convicted of equivalent offenses could expect a less degrading but still capital sentence. This differential reinforced the social hierarchy. The body of the commoner could be used as a public lesson. The noble's body, though still subject to sovereign justice, retained a degree of dignity even in death. Contemporary records and legal commentary show that punishments for counterfeiting could vary widely by locality and by magistrate, and that they sometimes combined executions with other corrective measures aimed at removing the tools and means of continued fraud. Over time, shifting legal philosophies and administrative reforms reduced reliance on the most extreme corporal penalties, as authorities increasingly favored measures that protected economic order with fewer spectacles of violence. Still, during the medieval period, the severe treatment of counterfeiters underlined how intimately monetary stability, royal authority, and communal trust were bound together, and how the penalties chosen were meant to embody those intertwined priorities. Crucifixion, borrowing and transforming an ancient execution method. In medieval Europe, the literal practice of driving a condemned person onto a cross was largely out of step with Christian sensibilities and therefore uncommon. Nevertheless, rulers and courts preserved the essential purpose of crucifixion: public humiliation and prolonged visibility of the punished body, by adopting other forms of display. Gibbeting, the practice of hanging a corpse in an iron cage for all to see, became a familiar substitute in many towns and along major roads. Bodies or severed heads were also mounted on bridges and city gates. London Bridge, for example, became notorious as a place where executed traitors' heads were exhibited to warn would-be rebels and highwaymen. Such measures targeted crimes seen as particularly corrosive to public order: brigandage, piracy, highway robbery, and high treason. Elsewhere in the medieval world, the concept of crucifixion persisted in juridical discourse and, at times, in practice, but often with important legal and interpretive differences from the Roman model. In some Islamic legal traditions, the penalties prescribed for severe violent crimes included a form of crucifixion or public display, though jurists debated the proper execution and whether symbolic acts, amputation plus display, fulfilled the law's intent. That debate mattered because it shaped how communities balanced retribution with practical concerns about cruelty, contagion, and the maintenance of social norms. The outcome varied by polity and by the nature of the offense. Brigandage and attacks on travelers were singled out in many legal codes as deserving the harshest, most visible responses. Social rank strongly determined how the visual logic of crucifixion was applied. Nobles and knights, when condemned, were more likely to receive decapitation, a quicker and, in elite terms, less dishonorable death, while commoners faced hanging, burning, or mutilation that emphasized shame as well as pain. For crimes that threatened the polity itself, such as treason, the bodies of lower status offenders might be dismembered and their parts exhibited. The same symbolic landscape that made crucifixion abhorrent for Christians was nonetheless harnessed to mark out and punish those of lesser rank more severely in public. The contrast reinforced social hierarchies. An execution was not only punishment for a crime, but also a theatrical reaffirmation of who held power and who could be humiliated without jeopardizing the dignity of the ruling orders. Medieval penal philosophy shaped these transformations. Deterrence was explicit. Authorities believed that displaying a punished body would discourage imitators by making the cost unmistakable. Retribution mattered too. The public spectacle satisfied a communal sense that severe offenses required visible redress. At the same time, ideas of atonement and moral correction influenced rituals surrounding execution. Clerical intervention, last rites, and the framing of punishment as allowing repentance meant that sometimes the harshest penalties were accompanied by attempts at spiritual reconciliation or were altered to avoid appearing to imitate Christ's redemptive suffering. Practical considerations also guided the shift away from full crucifixion toward display and spectacle. Urban populations, concerns over sanitary conditions, and the symbolic power of Christian iconography all played roles. Displaying a corpse on a bridge or in a cage accomplished the state's aims, deterrence and humiliation, without converting a site of Christian devotion into an instrument of secular justice. In essence, medieval societies borrowed the communicative force of the cross, the way it signaled shame and public correction, but transformed its mechanics and meaning to fit religious norms, legal traditions, and social hierarchies. The advent of the guillotine, the humanitarianism and industrialization of death. In the era of radical legal reform following revolutionary upheavals, debates over punishment shifted from ritual and status toward claims of reason and humanity. Prior to those reforms, the choice of execution method was a clear marker of social rank and the perceived gravity of the offense. Nobles were often granted beheading with a sword as a presumed quick and honorable death, while commoners faced hanging, breaking on the wheel, or burning, punishments that combined physical torment with public humiliation. Crimes such as regicide and treason normally carried the severest penalties because they threatened the political order. Violent crimes like murder similarly attracted capital sentences, whereas crimes seen as moral or religious affronts, heresy or witchcraft, were frequently met with burning. This patchwork of penalties reflected not only legal codes, but social hierarchies and local customs. A proposal put forward by physicians and reformers argued for a single, swift, mechanized method intended to minimize suffering and to make the law impartial in its last act. Medical men who studied wounds and death backed the idea that a clean, rapid severing of the neck would end conscious suffering more reliably than an axe stroke that could be clumsy or a hanging that might result in prolonged strangulation. Engineers and instrument makers translated those theories into a standardized apparatus, and lawmakers saw in it an opportunity to systematize executions across jurisdictions. The rhetoric was powerful. Equate all condemned persons at the moment of death, reduce unnecessary suffering, and enact the sovereign's judgment with technical certainty. Adoption of the apparatus changed the logistics and symbolism of capital punishment. Executions became more standardized affairs, equipment built to repeat the same motion, operators trained to work quickly, records kept about procedures, and that standardization introduced an industrial quality to the administration of death. The state transformed execution into a bureaucratic act. Petitions, pleas for clemency, judicial pronouncements, and the carrying out of sentences moved along administrative channels. Public spectacle remained for a time, but the spectacle's character altered. What had once been an often prolonged, highly personal display of authority and degradation was increasingly presented as a demonstration of legal order, efficiency, and medicalized mercy. Philosophies of punishment shaped and were shaped by this change. Retribution retained its place. The state asserted the right to impose proportional suffering for grave wrongs, but the methods used suggested a new emphasis on deterrence through certainty rather than cruelty. A rapid, ostensibly painless death was defended as both more humane and more morally defensible. Proponents argued that a civilized society could both punish and preserve human dignity at the point of execution. At the same time, atonement and spiritual reconciliation remained part of the ritual. Chaplains continued to be present, and opportunities for confession were maintained precisely because the moral economy of punishment still valued repentance. Yet the clinical efficiency of the new device complicated notions of redemption by reducing the time available for personal reckoning in the public eye. Practical realities, however, complicated the ideal of equality before the instrument. Legal processes, access to competent defense, and social influence still affected who was condemned and how quickly sentences were carried out. The device leveled the physical experience of death, but not the wider inequalities in prosecution, trial, or commutation. Political uses of the apparatus also exposed tensions. When mass prosecutions and frequent executions became tools of state consolidation, the same technical efficiency, praised as humane, could be criticized as depersonalizing and banalizing killing. The more routine executions became, the more debates emerged about whether making death efficient risked normalizing state violence. Examples from various courts illustrate the contrasts. High-status offenders continued, in practice, to benefit from legal negotiation and commutation even when the apparatus existed. Conversely, common criminals and political dissidents were more vulnerable to swifter administration of sentences. Legislators and jurists who argued for reform often cited the unequal cruelty of prior punishments, public torture for some, swift honor for others, as incompatible with evolving ideals of citizenship and legal uniformity. Their solution aimed to reconcile the competing goals of retribution, deterrence, and minimization of suffering, though implementation revealed the limits of technical fixes in resolving deep social inequities. In the end, the introduction of a single mechanized method reshaped public understandings of state power and humaneness. It presented the administration of death as a problem of design and procedure, not merely morality and spectacle. That reframing allowed authorities to claim progress while also concentrating responsibility for killing within professionalized, impersonal institutions. The result was neither pure compassion nor simple cruelty. Rather, it was a complex realignment of punishment practices, social stratification, and penal philosophy, one that made execution more standardized and ostensibly more humane, while also enabling a more efficient, bureaucratic enforcement of capital law. How fear shaped the social order. Public executions and corporal punishments functioned as deliberate instruments of social regulation, visible demonstrations of what behavior would be tolerated and what would not. For crimes against property, such as theft or highway robbery, communities often meted out mutilation, hanging, or the pillory to mark offenders as both dangerous and dishonorable. For crimes against the person, punishment could range from execution to compensation or exile, depending on the offender's status and the local legal custom. Treason and acts that directly challenged sovereign authority were singled out for the most spectacular penalties. In some polities, those convicted of high treason faced processes designed to humiliate and dismember, while nobles who committed equivalent crimes more commonly received beheading, a quicker death and one understood as more dignified. Heresy and challenges to religious orthodoxy were frequently met by burning or other methods intended to erase the perceived spiritual contagion, a choice that combined juridical punishment with ecclesiastical condemnation. The distribution of methods itself taught people where they stood in the social order. Beheading signified rank. The sword was the instrument of honor, reserved for those of noble birth or office. Commoners, by contrast, could expect hanging, breaking on the wheel, or public shaming. Punishments designed not only to kill or maim, but to mark the offender's lowly status in the eyes of all who watched. Clergy, merchants, and other privileged groups could sometimes invoke legal protections such as benefit of clergy or sanctuary, shifting proceedings into ecclesiastical fora where corporal spectacle was less likely and penance or fines might substitute. These distinctions reinforced hierarchy by making legal inequality visible. The body punished, and the manner in which it was punished, communicated rank as clearly as dress or title. Fear operated through several overlapping philosophies of punishment that shaped communal responses. Deterrence was explicit. The more public and painful the sanction, the clearer the warning to others. Retribution played its part too, rooted in moral and social notions of honor and balance. A violent crime deserved a correspondingly severe response in order to restore order and satisfy the injured party or community. Atonement and spiritual remediation were woven into executions as well. Sermons, confession, and the promise of last rites transformed the scene into a moral lesson about sin and reconciliation. At the same time, pragmatic mechanisms, fines, blood money, or negotiated settlements, offered alternatives that could avert the spectacle, demonstrating how pain and payment both served social equilibrium. Because punishments were enacted in public and under official auspices, they became communal rituals that stabilized everyday life. Spectacles of punishment reminded people of the state's monopoly on legitimate violence and of the limits of acceptable conduct. Yet the same spectacles could also reveal tensions. Harsh or seemingly arbitrary executions sometimes provoked sympathy for the condemned or unrest among witnesses, indicating that fear was a fragile tool. Overall, fear underpinned order by reinforcing legal boundaries, codifying social rank, and giving moral and political force to authority. It maintained compliance not only through immediate terror, but by embedding a shared understanding of honor, guilt, and the proper shape of justice. As we've seen, medieval execution was a structured part of law, not random cruelty. Punishments were chosen to match perceived crimes. Petty theft and minor violence often brought fines, mutilation, or public shaming. Murder and serious violent crimes could mean death. Treason and heresy were treated as threats to the realm or divine order and met the harshest penalties. Methods reflected social rank. Nobles more commonly received decapitation as a quicker, honorable end, while commoners were more likely to be hanged, beaten, or otherwise publicly punished. Execution and spectacle served multiple goals at once: to punish and exact retribution, to deter others through visible example, and in some beliefs to restore moral order or allow atonement. Key points to take away. Medieval punishments were legal and cultural tools tailored to crime and status. They reinforced social hierarchies, and they were justified by contemporary philosophies of retribution, deterrence, and spiritual atonement. Over time, these practices evolved. Technological, legal, and intellectual shifts pushed societies toward methods claimed to be more efficient, more equal, and eventually toward reform. If this history surprised or unsettled you, you're not alone. These stories force us to confront how societies balance justice, power, and human dignity. If you want to follow the next step of this story, subscribe and join us. In the next episode, we'll trace the transition into the early modern era, the rise of new punishment philosophies, and how that long arc led to instruments like the guillotine and later reforms. Leave a comment with your questions or sources you'd like us to explore, and check the description for further reading.